On the outside, the Durango Hellcat looks very much like the rest of the Durango lineup. For 2021, it's received a minor refresh to the exterior and interior styling, but the important word there to keep in mind is minor. The most welcome change up front are new full LED headlights. These are a combination of LED projectors and LED reflectors right there in the middle. We also have LED accent lights that double as the turn signals inside each module. The bumper is new for 2021, but you can see that the styling is very similar to the SRT model from last year. There's some additional vent openings down lower in the bumper. The hood's pretty similar to last year's SRT model. We have functional vents to let air out of the engine compartment and of course let air in right there up front as well. For 2021, Dodge made no sheet metal changes, so the side profile looks exactly the same as before. We don't even have increased fender flares for the Hellcat model, and that did surprise me a little bit. I sort of expected some tacked-on fender flares when we first heard that there would be a 700 horsepower Durango. That means that we still have 295 width tires, the same width tires that we find on the SRT model. In terms of length, this is just over 200 inches long, putting it on the long side for a 3-row crossover. I know some folks object to calling the Durango and the Grand Cherokee crossovers, but in reality, these are one of the few crossovers available in North America, because something like a Toyota Highlander or a Honda Pilot, they're really just a lifted minivan. And theoretically, the crossover name implies that there are some truck attributes mixed with some passenger car attributes. And that's certainly what we find going on in the Durango and, of course, the closely related Grand Cherokee. The Durango really is just a 3-row Grand Cherokee. Unlike the Yukon, the Tahoe, or the Expedition, this is a unibody vehicle, so there's no separate frame under the body. That means that the Durango is more space efficient, generally speaking, than most of those large 3-row SUVs. We have relatively similar room on the inside in a slightly smaller package. But because the drivetrain layout is related to Ram's pickup truck line, we have a V8 engine under the hood, rear-wheel drive layout, the same 8-speed automatic transmission that we find in the Ram pickup truck line. When you compare that to most of the crossovers out there in North America, there is absolutely zero pickup truck going on under the hood of a Highlander, a Traverse, or anything along those lines. Out back, we have combination tail lamp modules. This racetrack oval, which is what they call the red line that wraps from one side around to the other, is an LED element, as are the brake lights and turn signals, but the backup lights right here in the middle are incandescent. At the bottom of the hatch, we have a somewhat discreet SRT badge and then enormous dual exhausts at the bottom. Behind the bumper bump, we find the 2-inch receiver, 7-pin wiring harness, and 4-pin wiring harness if you get that option. Under the hood, we have a variant of the 6.2-liter supercharged Hellcat engine that we find in a wide variety of FCA products, from the absolutely bonkers Ram TRX to the Dodge Demon. Under this hood, it produces 710 horsepower, 645 pound-feet of torque. It's mated only to an 8-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. That's different than the rest of the Hellcat lineup in the United States, but suspiciously similar to the Grand Cherokee, because this is exactly the same drivetrain that we find in the Trackhawk. I've always been a little bit disappointed that Dodge hasn't jammed this all-wheel drive system under the hood of the Charger or the Challenger Hellcat, because that could make their 0 to 60 times even more impressive. The transfer case behind this transmission is a little bit different than the one that we find in Durangos with the 5.7-liter V8. That one has a 2-speed transfer case, so it does have a low ratio mode. It has a traditional locking center coupling right there in that transfer case, and it will split torque 50-50 front and rear in that mode. Also, of course, it gives you the low range ability. This has no low range mode, and the transfer case is electronically variable. So it can apportion power 50-50 front and rear. You'll find that in the tow mode, or it can have a pretty extreme rear power bias, but it will always be sending some power to the front. The seats remain essentially the same as before in the front row, second row, and third row. That means the top end trims have a powered driver's seat with 4-way adjustable lumbar support and a passenger seat with exactly the same range of motion, including the 4-way lumbar. That's relatively rare in this segment. The driver's seat has a 2-position memory over there on the door, and it is linked with the powered tilt telescopic steering column, also a little bit unusual in this segment. Remember that when the Dodge Durango and the related Jeep Grand Cherokee first launched, they were related to some Mercedes vehicles out there. There is still a bit of a relationship, and one of those relationships is the steering column. As before, the Durango is available with your choice of 5, 6, or 7 passenger seating. You can get a 3rd row delete option and your choice of a bench seat or captain's chairs in the 2nd row. If you choose captain's chairs in the 2nd row, you can also get this fixed in place center console. Let me flip that headrest back right there. Or you can delete the center console to make access to the 3rd row a little bit easier. The design of the 2nd row console is pretty similar to the front console. There's some storage in there, 2 fixed cup holders. Personally, I deleted it and opted for the in-floor cup holders because it does make getting to the 3rd row an awful lot easier. Getting into the 3rd row is pretty easy, but you'll notice the 2nd row seats move in kind of an old school fashion. This is not a tilt and slide mechanism like we see in most modern 3-row crossovers. Because of the double fold mechanism, you couldn't leave a child seat or a booster seat in position and still easily access the 3rd row. But you could do that again if you deleted the 2nd row console. Hopping into the way back, we find more third-row legroom and more third-row headroom than we find in a wide variety of mid-size crossovers. Even though the second-row seat does not slide forward and backward in its tracks, I have about 1.5 inches of legroom left, and if I sit very upright and try and put my head back there to the headrest, it is touching the ceiling, but in a more natural sitting position, right like I am here, I still have about 1 inch of headroom left. The seat bottom cushion is also not completely slammed to the floor like we find in some of the smaller crossovers out there, but this is only a 2-position bench seat, so no version of the Durango will ever seat 8 passengers. That's likely because the Durango was designed to accommodate some pretty wide tires, 295 width tires all the way around. That meant that the wheel wells had to be pretty big, and these wheel wells definitely intrude on the interior. Both rows of rear seat passengers get air vents. They're located right here in the ceiling. The third row has a cup holder on each side, but no USB power ports. Cargo room is relatively generous in the Durango. In my 24-inch roller bag test, you can put 2 24-inch roller bags back here behind the third row, but like most 3-row vehicles, the third row is going to spend the vast majority of its life folded, and in that position, you can definitely put at least 7 24-inch roller bags in here. A nice touch that we for some reason don't find in all 3-row crossovers is that the roller cargo cover can be put in 2 positions, one right back here behind the third row seat so you can still cover your cargo, or all the way up there right behind the second row seats. Since this is the SRT Hellcat model, you'll notice we have red seat belts even back here in the third row. Under the cargo area load floor, we have a little bit of additional storage space. This is also where we find the jack, and the spare tire is completely underneath the Durango. One thing I've always found a little bit odd with the Durango is that if you get the 6.4-liter V8 engine, or now the 6.2-liter V8, we don't get a full-size spare tire in the back. We do have a compact spare. It's a pretty big compact spare, but it is still a compact. I suspect if you really wanted to, you could put a full-size spare back here, but it might affect the departure angles. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that I am inside the SRT Hellcat at the moment. We don't have a moonroof right here over the driver or front passengers' heads. A pretty standard-sized moonroof is available in most of the Durango lineup. In case you're wondering, the controls for the third zone of the automatic climate control system are located right back there in the ceiling. If this had a sunroof, it would be right behind the sunroof. Since this is the SRT model, we have red shoulder belts, 4-way adjustable headrests, and the SRT Hellcat logo embossed on the leather seats. This particular model also has the optional rear seat entertainment system. Not a whole lot's changed there, so we still get the AV inputs and an HDMI input on each seat back. The seats in the Hellcat trim are basically the same seats that we found in the regular SRT model before. Moving over to the front doors, we find some very minor changes for 2021, but my main complaint about the front door design remains constant for this model year, and it's right here just in front of the window switches. I've always thought that this tiny section of hard plastic right there is oddly placed because we have a soft touch stitched armrest and then soft touch material right there on the upper section of the door. This particular model has carbon fiber trim, but it's carbon fiber with a bit of a twist. They actually shred the carbon fiber and then put it in there. It sort of has, I guess, a linoleum-like motif, I guess is what you'd say. Perhaps they're going for terrazzo or something along those lines. Below that, we have hard plastics again down there around that bottle holder. This one has the optional Harman Kardon audio system, so there are 2 speakers integrated into the door. And then integrated into the A-pillar, we have another speaker right there next to the rearview mirror. The dashboard is where things really changed for 2021, so let's just take a quick pan across the dashboard and then we'll take a look at some of the individual components. You notice that the style is definitely different than before, but some of the bits and bobs remain the same. The dashboard air vents have been restyled. They're now a bit more rectangular. You can see that we have more stitched materials going on the dashboard. We have a stitched upper section of the dash like we found in upper end trims of the Durango before, and then a stitched lower section of the dashboard to help dress things up. A bit more of that carbon fiber trim there. The glove box is very similar to the one that we had before. It's a bin style glove compartment. To the left of that, we have a 12-volt power port. In the middle of the dashboard, we find a new, larger infotainment system. This is now just over 10 inches, and it's also slightly tilted towards the driver. This is running the latest software from FCA. This is Uconnect 5 rather than Uconnect 4. This is now based on the Android operating system, and it supports wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto. If you want to know more about this infotainment system, be sure and check out my complete video on that. The biggest thing you're going to notice about this is how much snappier it is than the previous generation system. We also have a few more integrations. This now has Sirius XM 360. We also have Amazon Alexa integration. So if you want to Alexa enable the vehicle, you can command all of your Alexa devices, smart switches, that sort of thing right from the car. You'll also notice that if I click over to the SRT and then click the performance page options, this loads much, much faster than the previous generations of the system. That's probably the absolute biggest difference here, is how fast things load. They say this processor is 5 times faster than the previous model, which definitely is a significant improvement. As before, climate control functions can be accessed both from this infotainment system or from physical buttons below. One thing that surprised me is that we don't have a backup camera update or a 360-degree camera option in the Durango, because The bulk of the vehicle's hardware has not been updated for 2021. They just sort of grafted in the new infotainment system. To the left of the infotainment screen, we find the engine start-stop button and a trailer brake controller. This is a feature that I really wish my Durango had. It's basically the same trailer brake controller that we find in the Ram pickup truck lineup. Below the infotainment screen itself, we find the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control up front. If you want to control the third climate control zone, that's done strictly through the infotainment system. There are a few more physical buttons than we had last year, so dedicated buttons for the heated and ventilated seats along with a steering wheel heater button. You can still do those through the software, but we now have physical buttons for them as well. You can also directly access the SRT pages in the infotainment system with the SRT button, and then an easy one-click access for the launch control. Hazard light toggle right there in the middle. Toggle for the parking sensors on off, and then lane keeping assistance. Below the button bank, we have 4 USB inputs, 2 regular USB and 2 USB-C inputs. You can connect up to 2 devices, so those pair of ports are paired together. We have a Qi wireless charging mat. Right now my phone is on there, but it's actually not paired with the wireless CarPlay. I decided just to go ahead and plug it in because it seemed to have caused some problems with my GoPro app. Over here on this side, we have exactly the same shifter that we had before. Manual mode is over to the left there. 2 large cup holders, a small little storage area right there, and then depending on the model of Durango you get, there would be an optional all-wheel drive mode selector there. Rather unfortunately, the infotainment upgrade did not bring with it an LCD instrument cluster upgrade. So this is still essentially the same instrument cluster that we've seen in the Durango for a while. It's a partial LCD unit. We have a 7-inch LCD right there in the middle, and then some physical gauges around each side. There are some cosmetic changes for 2021, but the bulk of this remains the same. So we still have a speedometer over here on the left. It's a physical speedometer, but it now goes up to 200 miles an hour. The graphics have been slightly tweaked in the central LCD, but a lot of these readouts we already had in the SRT model for 2020. You can see engine horsepower, engine torque there, air-fuel ratio, boost pressure, tons of additional gauges and readouts. This is a very fully functioned display. It just doesn't feel quite as modern as the LCD that we find, for instance, in the Ram 1500 or in some of those newer products out in the market. Also essentially the same as before are the steering wheels. This is obviously the SRT steering wheel. You can see we have SRT right there in the middle, but this is not the new SRT wheel that we find, for instance, in the Ram TRX. The buttons are a little bit different. They're the older design, same as we had on the 2020 Durango, and the paddle shifters are still just paddles up top, not below, because we do have the infotainment control buttons on the back of the steering wheel. Track forward, backward on the left, and then volume up, down over here on the right. The steering wheel itself is a thickly rimmed, leather-wrapped model. It has a flat bottom, sort of angular sides right down there on the bottom. I find it to be a very comfortable steering wheel, but I know some folks really dislike thick steering wheels. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. We find the controls for the adaptive cruise control over here on the right side, also regular cruise control up front, so you can choose which one you want to use, and then the controls for that multifunction LCD over here on the left. Let's talk about the performance numbers up front. According to Dodge, this will go 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. That's astonishing for a vehicle that weighs over 5,700 pounds. Yes, the Durango is certainly heavy and it has not lost any weight for 2021. That's mainly because the Durango is not exactly a spring chicken. This design has been around for quite some time. But the bones of the Durango are excellent. This is very closely related to the Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk, and this benefits from everything going on in that Jeep model. Unfortunately, I haven't had this at home to give it an official 0 to 60 test. However, it's likely going to be a little bit lower than that number, especially if you use launch control. Yes, this is a 3-row crossover with launch control. The last time I drove the Grand Cherokee Trackhawk, it went 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, which is faster than Jeep claims, and some folks out there have been able to get even faster times than that Jeep. It is absolutely insanely fast. The big difference between the rest of the Hellcat lineup and this Dodge Durango and of course the Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk is that we have all-wheel drive in here, and all-wheel drive helps this vehicle apply power in a way that the Dodge Charger and the Dodge Challenger simply can't. The initial launch from a stop is not quite as aggressive as some of those high horsepower EVs out there, but EVs tend to run out of steam at higher speeds, and engines like this are really getting into their stride at around 40 or 50 miles an hour. That's how this will do the quarter mile in 11.5 seconds. That quarter mile time has been certified by the National Hot Rod Association, and should you ever be willing to do such a thing in a 3-row vehicle, this has a top speed of 180 miles an hour. That puts the Durango in a very exclusive set of vehicles out there when it comes to performance. The Durango is faster than the already absolutely insane Mercedes-Benz GLS. It's faster than a BMW X7. This is BMW X5M kind of performance, but with a 3rd row. Now on the downside, the Durango Hellcat does not get any major body modifications. So this doesn't have any massive fender flares front and rear, so they weren't able to stick really insane wide tires on this. This has 295 width tires. Those are pretty wide for a crossover or an SUV, whatever it is you want to call the Durango, but they're not as wide as some performance vehicles out there. especially some performance SUVs or crossovers like the BMW X5M. The Durango also, as I said, is pretty heavy, so handling ability in the Durango is definitely going to be good for a crossover in the mainstream, but it's not going to be that absolutely insane next level that we find in some of those luxury performance vehicles. Now, bear in mind that the Durango is an awful lot less expensive than something like a BMW X5M. Much like the Grand Cherokee Trackhawk, the Durango has a great ride out on the road. Now, there are selectable drive modes here because this has an adaptive suspension system. The SRT and the Hellcat Durango are the only Durangos with this adaptive suspension system. Right now I'm in Auto, which is the softest. I can put it in Sport, things definitely firm up. I can put it in Track, things firm up even further. But even in the Track mode, this is not as hardcore as some of those high-performance luxury SUVs. That means that even though we have absolutely insane 0 to 60 times and quarter mile times, this is a very livable daily driver style vehicle. My only complaint about that, and the only problem for daily driving really, is the exhaust note. Now, it sounds glorious. It really has a great sound to it. I'll go ahead and rev it up here. I feel sorry for these neighbors along the road. It has a great sound. It burbles, it pops, it's got all those glorious Hellcat exhaust note tones to it, but it's not a variable exhaust note. So there's no valve in the exhaust, there's no way to quiet it down. That means that if you do live in an urban area, say you're in the middle of suburbia or something like that, and you want to start this on a nice cold foggy morning where sound really carries, your neighbors might not really love your choice of vehicle. I would love to say that perhaps in the future Dodge could put an active exhaust on the Durango Hellcat, but that's unlikely to happen because this engine is a one-year special only in the Durango. A lot of folks have asked why that is. The big reason apparently is evaporative emissions. The change does not affect the new Ram TRX because that has a slightly different version of the 6.2-liter V8 engine and different evaporative emissions control systems. You might be wondering why they didn't just use the system from the Ram TRX then. The biggest reason is likely going to be cost. You see, the Durango at its heart really is just a stretched Grand Cherokee, and that meant that everything from the Grand Cherokee Trackhawk would fit under the hood and under the body of the Durango. The emissions control systems, the engine control systems, the cooling systems, all that kind of stuff from the Trackhawk just went right into the Durango. According to the rumor mill, the Grand Cherokee is going to get a complete redesign next year, and that's going to probably orphan the Durango for a year or two until this either gets a redesign or until the Durango gets canceled and replaced with something else. The future is a little bit uncertain right now. And now to the tricky subject of fuel economy. Clearly, when an engine is producing almost double the horsepower of the 5.7-liter V8, you're going to have a pretty serious fuel economy hit in the Durango. If you get the Durango in the 5.7, it's pretty easy to average 21 miles per gallon if you're doing mostly highway driving at 65 miles an hour with the cruise control set, steady state highway runs, etc. The 5.7 really isn't that inefficient. It gets pretty similar fuel economy to a wide variety of mid-size and slightly larger crossovers or SUVs. Generally speaking, it's a little bit more efficient than some of those large full-size SUVs that you might want to cross-shop the Durango with. But down here with the SRT Hellcat Durango, you're probably going to be averaging about 12 to 13 miles per gallon. During a day of driving in North Carolina, mainly out on country roads like I'm on here, where speeds are between 55 and 60 miles an hour, I've been averaging 13.6 miles per gallon. But when you get this out on the track, you should definitely expect single-digit fuel economy numbers. If you want to get your hands on a Durango Hellcat, you do need to act fast because these are going to be built, as I said, for only one model year. But Dodge is not limiting the production, so this is not some sort of limited run, only 2,000 or 3,000 units. They're going to build as many as they possibly can for as many customers as they can get for the 2021 model year, but really only for one model year. For most folks out there, pricing is going to be the limiting factor. This is obviously the most expensive version of the Durango. It starts just under $81,000, of course, excluding tax, title, license, and that pesky destination fee. There are two ways to look at that price tag. This is either enormously expensive for a 3-row family hauler, or strangely a good deal when you compare this against a lot of performance SUVs and crossovers. It's a lot less expensive, for instance, than something like a BMW X5M, and it has a 3rd row that you can't find in the X5M. When it comes to high horsepower 3-row crossovers or SUVs, there just aren't very many options out there. Something like a Mercedes-Benz GLS 63 comes to mind. It definitely has a lot of performance ability, but it's not quite as fast as the Durango, and it is an awful lot more expensive. In fact, you could get a Charger for weekdays and a Durango for the weekends if you wanted to for about the same price as that GLS 63. Even in Hellcat form, the Durango is also going to be less expensive than many full-size SUVs out there. The new Chevy Tahoe and the new GMC Yukon got pretty expensive in this latest generation. The Ford Expedition's also pretty spendy, and the Dodge Durango will out-tow the vast majority of those competitors except for the absolute top-end trims of entries like the Ford Expedition. But you'll still get more power under this hood. So even though theoretically that Expedition could go up to 9,300 pounds in that neighborhood if you properly equip your Expedition, towing 8,000 pounds with this versus the Expedition, this is going to be an awful lot easier because we just get so much more power out of this engine, and absolute gobs of torque. Nearly 700 pound-feet of torque, over 700 horsepower under the hood. If you're like me and you regularly tow with your mid-size crossover and you can afford an $81,000 starting price, plus of course possible dealer markups here in 2021, there really is nothing like the Durango Hellcat out there. This is probably the ultimate craziest thing that FCA has ever done. Take a 3-row, nearly 6,000 pound vehicle, jam 710 horsepower under the hood, and allow you to do up to 180 miles an hour. Be sure to let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what on earth would you be cross-shopping with something like this Durango Hellcat? Let me know about all that down there. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexAutos, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week. Be sure, of course, and take a look at my review that focuses a little bit more on the rest of the Durango lineup for 2021 as well.